Hi everyone. You can still see my screen,
Yeah.
right? Okay, cool. So welcome to our brown bag, keeping up with the news without losing your mind, affectionately titled. And it's a discussion for the diabetes community. So we have three wonderful panelists here today, Alison Nimlas, Austin Scott, and Bosma Adams. If you are not familiar with DPAC yet, we are a policy advocacy organization. We do advocacy on the state and the national levels. We have advocates nationwide, and we train them on how to effectively advocate for diabetes policy. We also have relationships with lawmakers. We basically just connect people to their representatives, and we empower them to take action. So if you aren't already involved with DPAC or an advocate, you can scan that QR code. You can also add us on any of our social networks, which you'll see on the bottom right of the screen. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists really quickly to just give like a 10-second intro so that you can get to know each other better. Austin, want to go first with what looks like a cat?
Yeah, I'm fighting my cat's tail, so I apologize. She comes out whenever I'm on meeting. She hears the voices and wants to hang out with us. Hey, everybody. My name's Austin. I live in Toronto, Canada, and I've been living with type 1 diabetes for about 23 years now. I started creating diabetes-focused content maybe in the last 6 or so months. I actually work in social services for a living, so I feel like this is a great crossover between my professional life and my personal life. And a lot of the content I create focuses on the emotional and mental side of living with diabetes and just the parts of it that are invisible to other people.
uh, Cosmo, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Bosma Adams. I'm a registered nurse by training, started out in the pediatric ICU, so peds focused. I'm a current PhD candidate doing research on diabetes and diabetes distress, and I've had diabetes for over 2 decades now. I started out as a diabetes content creator as well. I work in the diabetes space, so I like to say I eat, live, breathe diabetes. And I'm excited to be here.
Hey, and last but not least, Allison.
Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Nimlas. I am a licensed therapist, a certified diabetes care and education specialist, and I have been living with type 1 diabetes for 32 years. And I live in the Twin Cities in Minnesota.
Oh, well, thank you all for joining us. I'll get right into it. So, our first question is for each of you, what does the current news cycle around diabetes and health policy feel like from your perspective? And whoever wants to jump in, you can just jump in.
I think for me, it's very interesting because I'm a Canadian. And so it feels kind of, it's an interesting spot to be in because I feel like headlines nowadays are created to incite like a reaction immediately, whether that's fear, anger, panic, hope. And when you've lived with diabetes for as long as I have, like 23 years, you start to build a defense mechanism against a lot of the news because you're like, I'm going to be cynical because it's easier to be cynical than to put false hope into things and then hope that that thing comes to fruition. And I think a lot of the time, as someone who is, again, living in Canada, it's tough because I want to be part of the advocacy. I want to be on the front lines, but also a lot of that advocacy is centered around the United States. You guys are the forerunners in diabetes, diabetes care, diabetes technology. And so for me, it feels so personal because so much of the news relates to things that I want to be part of, but can't be part of. And so I think that's where content creation for me bridged that gap. It became an outlet for me to share about diabetes and do my part because I can't call a congresswoman or congressman to say, hey, let's make some changes because I don't have that level of access. So I think it's very interesting because these headlines aren't just like things happening in the community. These are whether or not I live or breathe tomorrow. And that is such a stark line. And it's a weird contrast to have to face.
I think that's a really good point. I think Austin brings up a good point of how he feels kind of like sidelined because he's in Canada. I feel I'm in the US, so I'm in sunny California. And I feel sometimes it's like a whiplash. Like I get attached to whatever I see in the news because obviously there's hope behind it, there's emotion behind it, there's okay, maybe a cure is really out there. And then you have to reel it back in because there's so many other things that are kind of standing in the way between you and actually getting to that finish line. And I play around with the term finish line because is it really ever a finish line? That's a whole nother discussion for another day. But it can be difficult because as Austin said, you want to be in the present, and you want to really ground yourself in like what is actual truth and what is reality. But as humans, we have this nurture and nature part of our hearts that we want to hope for more, we want to hope for better. So that's why I call it whiplash, because I think we're constantly going back and forth. And as all of us here in content creation and social media, a lot of in healthcare, like we also have to teeter these invisible lines of like what we do for work and what we do for fun and how we create content and how we show up for others. So I think it can be difficult, and I think that's why you have to really kind of have a strong foundation, a strong support system to lean back on, because we're only humans and we can only take so much good news or bad news at a time before it starts to weigh on us emotionally.
Yeah, and I've been writing and covering the diabetes sphere for probably about 20 years now, and I feel like maybe I've just been doing this for so long that I'm now at the point where I'm jaded. I don't know if people who are watching can relate to that sensation, but like I hear things about like, a new breakthrough or new technology or, whatever is kind of being, passed around. I get things forwarded to me or seen shared on social media. And I don't know. I just like, okay, yeah, like let me know when it's available to the entire population. Like I don't know if I really care yet. I think because in my early years, like you get so invested in things. You're like, yes, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's gonna be, it's coming. I'm of the generation where like our endos really did say a cure was coming in 5 years and we believed them. And I think now it's just like, I don't know. Like I'm not an early adopter with the news. I gotta sit on it and just wait and see what happens.
No, I definitely relate to that too, as someone who is constantly on diabetes social media. Do you guys feel burnout? And if so, how do you manage that?
I feel like for all of us, burnout is just a natural part of existing with diabetes. And I think one thing that I've realized, because I had a 10-year stint where I just was like completely burnt out from diabetes. And one thing I realized is sometimes you have to own the burnout a little bit, is to say, like, I'm in this moment. It is okay to ask for help. It is okay to need resources. That's why I have friends. That's why I have family members. That's why I have a million cats. You have these innate resources that a lot of us are so afraid to like connect with and be part of. And I think a lot of the time the burnout is so easy to fall into. But I always say to myself, if one bad day leads to 6 good days, then why am I judging myself for that one bad day when I know that there will be better days as a result of giving myself the space to live in that burnout? I think we're all so fearful of the word burnout. We think of it as a moral failure, but there's no part of any single person's life on this call that requires them to be on and active 24/7. There's no relationship, no hobby, no job. And so I always say to people, you don't expect that from any part of your life. So why do you expect that from diabetes? Why do you hold diabetes to that standard in your life?
Yeah, I hope we can get to a point where burnout and distress are actually seen as, unfortunately and fortunately, I think both, the more that I do research on them, as normal parts of living with diabetes. And I think the more we normalize it, the more the stigma is taken away from it as this like thing that you did upon yourself and this form of failure. It's not failure at all. I don't know anybody that has had diabetes as long as the four of us, or even shorter amount of time, that hasn't experienced burnout. And it's a byproduct, I like to say, of living with diabetes and doing the daily ins and outs of, as Austin said, being on constantly and having to be your own pharmacist, being your own doctor, being your own nurse, being your own psychiatrist, being your own therapist. Like it really is just a product of living an invisible disease that is not so invisible to us. And I described it once as being, we have all the physical reminders, we have all the scars, we have all the infusion sets, we have all the Lancets, we have all the pumps. We personally have the very visual reminders. And so to us, it's not invisible. And I think that's what creates that disconnect, because to everybody else out around us, it's invisible. Um, but yeah, diabetes doesn't clock out at 5 p.m. So I think the burnout that comes with it is a byproduct of the ins and outs that we do, and then constantly seeing it online, constantly seeing news articles about it, constantly seeing maybe a hope about a cure. But then also we are all in a space where we create content around it, pretty often. I would say burnout for me hits closer to home, because it's actually why I stepped away from diabetes content for a long while, and I've only just started to kind of like get back into it, is because I realized my entire life was about this one disease that I also happen to live with. And there was no break. There was no escape that I could take. It was constantly thinking up of different videos to make. What's funny? What's trending? What's going around right now? What is everybody talking about? What's the latest and greatest product that I should like try and review and do this and that? And I realized it was weighing on me mentally. So, my biggest thing that I wish pe more people would know is that burnout is normal. It's okay. Ask for help. Use your resources. I promise you there's a way out of it. You just have to kind of go through it first.
Wow, thank you. That was really beautifully said.
Yeah, I would just echo what both Austin and Basma said. I remember talking to Bill Polanski, who's the founder of the Behavioral Diabetes Institute, and just describing diabetes distress as being just a normal part of living with diabetes. Like it's not a complication because it has nothing to do with how well or not well you're managing diabetes. And it's not pathological. Like it's not a mental illness. Like it's not something that we would diagnose because then that means that, that there's some kind of dysfunction or something, the way that we would see major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. Like it's not a disorder in that kind of category, that camp. It is just, as we've been saying, a manifestation of the stress and overwhelm that is a natural part of all of the work that goes into living with and managing diabetes. And I mean, when I look up burnout on the internet, oftentimes I get articles about work, and like we are not at work nearly as much as we are involved in diabetes. So if we're going to pay as much, that much attention to like work burnout, obviously we should be giving some credence to diabetes distress and diabetes burnout. Like that only makes sense to me.
Yeah, for sure. I remember hearing about the term like diabetes burnout for the first time, and it surprised me that it was like defined as like a long-term condition because I feel like it's experienced in short-term, long-term, like mega long-term. It's just like experienced in so many different ways. And I was like, oh, if anything, like the definition of that almost makes me feel like when I feel burnout, I have to be down for like several months, but like I don't have to be. If I am, that's fine, but it's up to you. So my next question is, why can it feel hard to step back from the news even when it's affecting us negatively? And then in particular for Allison as the resident psychological expert, what is happening psychologically when we're constantly consuming stressful or high stakes news? Allison, if you want to go first, that's yeah.
Yeah, I can go first. There's a lot. There's a lot that goes on when we're consuming a lot of news. So one of the things I think is important to understand, just like how our brain works, sort of the things that our brain is attracted to. And it might sound kind of funny to say that, but our brain is actually attracted to danger. Our brain it's naturally wired to look for negativity. We call it a negativity bias. And so when we're out in the world or when we're on social media or the news or, just kind of living life, our brain, our instinct is to always be searching for danger. And this is like evolutionary, right? Like we're going back to like the caveman era when we're talking about this, like about how and why our brains have developed this way. The problem is that the brain doesn't have a great way of actually distinguishing what is dangerous. It just sort of sees something that is dangerous and goes, "Oh, that's dangerous. I need to pay attention to this." And sometimes like I really need to pay attention to this. Like this is a really important thing to keep paying attention to because I've recognized this, as a problem. This is a threat to, my life, perhaps, even though it actually isn't. So, now in, the modern era, 21st century, the things that our brain used to recognize as like the bear and the lion is a news article from CNN, and it's just like, okay, like we have a really hard time differentiating. Like we're still getting that same emotional reaction, that fight or flight threat response is still happening in our amygdala. And so that's one of the reasons why I think having conversations like this is really helpful, because I think a lot of people don't realize that their reactions are normal, but they also we don't and shouldn't necessarily be supporting that reaction and that urge to kind of keep seeking out more information to kind of support that. Um, a couple other things. So there's that threat response, but there's also um, our brain has a need for certainty, right? And we probably relate very much to this and throughout a lot of diabetes management, fears about, going low. And like when we see like our down arrow, and we get that anxious feeling, it's because it's a threat response and also an uncertainty response. Like we don't know what's happening, and our brain is like, we need to know right now that we're going to be okay. And it will do whatever is in its power, in our power to get that. And so that's why people can often find themselves doing some of that doom scrolling, is it's giving us more information and more information and more information. And so we'll momentarily get this sense of relief of, okay, I've got more information. I'm feeling a little bit more prepared, but it tends to wear off. Like that threat doesn't really go away, and that uncertainty is still there. So then we're like, let's look for more, let's look for more, let's keep doom scrolling. And there's some other kind of psychological impact. The brain also responds to newness, and novelty. So that's why we keep seeking out more and more, different things. And so the brain and social media and the news and like the 24-hour news cycle in particular is like the news cycle really, the news knows psychology, right? Like they have really capitalized on how our brain works, basically for ad revenue. Um, they want to get us hooked. They want us to keep coming back to the news. They know what it is that our brains are attracted to. And you can see that playing out by clickbait, by how many visits and how many refreshes. Even when absolutely nothing is changing, we're like, let me just check again. Let me see what's new, what's happening now. That sense of urgency is really played up by the media. The media knows what it's doing. But unfortunately, so much of that exposure really has negative consequences. It leads to anxiety, and it leads to burnout and depression and just chronic stress. And that, is something that, we have a really hard time, managing in the long term, leading to things like burnout, like what we've been just talking about, like that constant consumption of really hard negative content and kind of living in this space is going to have mental health impact.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful to know, especially the part about like the unresolved, like us seeking the resolution and like therefore scrolling over and over until we see that news article that says everything's solved
Yeah,
or
everything's okay. We
yeah.
we live, I mean, as people like to, I don't know if it's obviously it's not literal, it's a metaphor, but the world is on fire. And so people feel like everything feels really unsafe, everything feels really scary. And so we don't have that psychological sense of safety that like we're okay, everything's going to be okay, everything's fine, we got it. People, we're handling it. We're very much in this place of like things are not being handled. Things are so not handled right now. And then we whether we consciously can say that or unconsciously, we're going, that's not okay. I need to keep figuring out, am I okay? Am I okay? And I'll just keep doing that.
Allison, do you find that some of that is rooted in, like, for example, we can't really control a lot of diabetes. Like, some of it is out of our hands, really, a lot of the time it can be. And so we lose a lot of our sense of control in a lot of situations. Do you find for us as diabetics, since we've lost that control in one part of our life, we try to make up for it potentially in the news articles that we look at, the content to say, I feel powerless in this one area of my life. And so the news can kind of solve or bridge some of that gap, or not necessarily? Because I find that, like, for me personally, that's I find I'm like the news is a sense of control. I can control what news I see, what outlets and what I choose to absorb in a way that I can't with my diabetes sometimes.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I do think I think people with diabetes in particular, I definitely see this with people I've worked with, just seek out control where they can. So rigidity can show up if they're, around, food choices or just like decisions that they're trying to kind of grasp for control because it can feel like I don't have a lot of say over life right now. And so yeah, what you said, I'm gonna try to find control where I can.
Yeah, you basically summed up exactly my experience with like news cycles and stuff like that. I also think it goes back to my point of how everything feels so abstract and far away in the news a lot of the time. But then when it comes to diabetes, you're like, no, this really does directly impact so many parts of my life, my health, my safety, the way I move through the world, the way I think about my job, my insurance. And so I think those news cycles can feel really negative and emotionally exhausting at times. And it's hard to disconnect from that because our algorithms want to show us that people react to that news, and then the more people react to it, the more the algorithm wants to show us it, right? So it's this weird balance in this new age of before we could just put a newspaper down, but now it's like it follows you everywhere you go. You can't get away from it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That I mean the media, whether that's social media, like internet media, TV, all of it is very much produced around the way that, psychologically, like what is going, like I said, what's going to be attractive, what's going to get the clicks, what's going to get the hits, what's going to get shared. And it is often the things that are sensationalized or negative or, oh my God, like, did you see what they did or what they said? And it's not pleasant. Like it doesn't actually make us feel good in the long run, but that immediate sense of knowing like, oh, I've gotten some information, that's kind of an emotional, I don't want to call it dopamine. I don't think that's probably what's happening, but there is there's an emotional reaction that we have that we then end up kind of finding ourselves in a vicious cycle because we need more of it.
And then we can see how 23 years later, cynicism becomes an easy defense mechanism to the news, right? Because you're like, well, I've seen this before. This story has played out. There's been hope in so many baskets. And where has that gotten me?
I'm a victim for sure. I just
We
like
all are.
don't
We all are.
care,
Yeah,
Yeah, when something's real, I'll pay attention to it. So yeah.
100%.
Yes. Sorry, Basma got kicked out of this meeting, so I'm shuffling a little bit to get her back in, but we can move on to the next question in the meantime. So my next question was, it might help some people in the diabetes community to know that there are others who feel a similar way, which I feel like this is already helping me a little bit. But what have you seen and heard in the diabetes space about burnout or about news lately?
I think as a content creator in this space, I hear it every single day from people that they are so burnt out, but they're not just burnt out from diabetes. I think it's so interesting how the content that people see can directly impact their own relationship with diabetes. I get so many people when I talk about like the mental health aspect of diabetes. So many people will either come, it's like a twofold approach. They either come to me and they go, why would you talk about that? You're making things so negative. And then there's the other side of it where people are like, but I resonate so deeply with what you just said. Someone has put to words the feelings that I haven't been able to explain. And so I think a lot of us are in this weird space where we're afraid to talk about the positives too much because we don't want to contribute to toxic positivity. But then on the other side, we don't want to put too much negative content out there because we don't want to contribute to that lens about diabetes either. And so a lot of us with diabetes, we are burnt out. We are all tired. We all experience it. But the number one thing is we are all living proof on this call that you can still live a meaningful, full, happy, joyful life with diabetes. Obviously, the burnout doesn't erase all of the hard parts or any of that and the great lives that we have built. But I think with diabetes, we have to realize like sometimes diabetes takes a backseat to life. Life comes first and diabetes will be second. And if you're experiencing burnout, you're not alone in that. Allison even posted about this today. Like, talk to your resources. You have friends, you have family members. Maybe they don't live with this and don't understand it every single day and they're not meant to, but they are still there. They're a part of your life. They understand the intricate ins and outs of your life. So don't be afraid to rely on friends. And that's what they're there for. for. They should be there to listen, to be a listening ear in those moments. And if you don't have friends who understand, find friends. The diabetes community is the most amazing thing I have ever done for myself, is just talking to people who get it. There is someone out there who is experiencing the same feelings as you are, and there is so much power in going, someone 1,000 miles away from me has had an experience I thought I was the only person living.
Yeah, absolutely. And something, Austin, you said kind of at the beginning, like the toxic positivity versus sharing. I think it's a tension that we walk when we are posting and sharing about life with diabetes. And I think it is important to share. Like it's important to talk about the realities of living with diabetes. I think it's also equally important to be aware of how the consumption of that content can impact your own mental health and your own journey. And I think, like with the news, we don't want to just like say, we're just going to cut it off. Like, I'm just never going to pay attention to the news ever again. And I've had clients who have said, like, I don't read the news. I'm like, well, that's probably, an extreme reaction. And so it's not, we don't want to have this like all or nothing response to anything really, but this this in particular. And I think in addition to that, I think being aware of when participating in the social media, and I don't know, I wish Bosma was here because maybe this is something that she was experiencing, participating in the diabetes online community can be really helpful, but it can also sort of it does force us to really think about things about diabetes and with from a particular lens. Like when you're hearing people who are talking about having a hard day, struggling with lows, or having, fears about insulin, etc. And if that's not something that's you're actually thinking about, and then you're suddenly exposed to it, maybe not unwillingly, like we're obviously choosing to follow people, but scrolling, it just sort of pops up and there it is. That's not necessarily what's going to be that's not necessarily going to feel helpful, is what I'm trying to say. Like news and social media is not always going to be the most helpful thing in every moment, and it is a useful skill to kind of know where you're at with things, and so sometimes, pulling back from checking, if you have a diabetes account, pulling back from checking it as often, kind of reducing how much you're checking the news as well, like not going cold turkey, but just saying like, I need to take more time away from this kind of content and I'll participate when I think it's going to be useful.
Yeah,
100%.
that's
That's the hardest part, is taking that step back though, right? Recognizing like what I'm seeing on my little magic square phone I take everywhere with me is actually contributing to my burnout and contributing to the way I feel and my relationship with diabetes. And two things can exist at the same time. You can love the people that you follow, but also go, no, this isn't actually great for where I'm currently at in my mental health, and I should step back from that. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I also wish Plasma was able to join right now because of what she mentioned earlier about having to take space away. But I also wanted to talk about what you mentioned, Austin, earlier about how people don't want to be too overwhelmingly positive online too, because of like the pushback of when people say like, oh, you're being like toxically positive. It's so interesting because I feel like there are so many like algorithms where people like I feel like some people on this call have maybe like literally never heard that criticism before. You know what I mean? Like some people's accounts are just only like toxic positivity, and then they end up feeling horrible about themselves because like they're not even aware that maybe like that this is being pushed back against in other accounts. So it's like it's really like the algorithm is like shoveling us into this tiny hole. And like maybe we're not getting the full picture. But yeah, it's just interesting how like you're in a certain space online where you see people being like, that's toxic positivity, and me too. But I feel like not everyone is even seeing that.
It's probably the hardest part of content creation with diabetes, is like I want to honor the fact that some days I have a 90% time in range and I want to show that off. But also in the back of my mind, I'm like, but there's somebody out there that has a 50%. And when they see my 90, that makes them feel worse about their 50. But that's not what I was trying to do. I'm trying to celebrate the fact that we all recognize how hard it was to get to that 90, even for myself. But in the same vein, it's like I don't want to upset the people who are at 50, because I used to be at 50 and I saw the 90s all the time. And I was like, And in some ways, it's weird because that's what pushed me to want to get to 90 was seeing other people in the 90s and seeing that people are living full, happy, positive lives while eating the foods they love and doing the things that they love. So for me, it's a really weird mental balance of like, I want to put positivity out there, but I also want to speak about the hard parts because I would be lying to everybody on this call if I pretended it was sunshine and rainbows constantly with diabetes. So it's a really
Mhm.
hard balance for me to have to strike.
Yeah, for sure. I'll ask this question to Bosma if she is able to rejoin. Sorry, I'm still working on things in the back end with her, but for Austin, at least, as a content creator in the diabetes space, have you ever felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of staying informed and informing others? Do you feel a responsibility to be the voice of the diabetes community sometimes? Because at DPAC as advocates, we sometimes feel a similar way when we go into like meetings with legislators, and because like suddenly we are the person like representing the entire diabetes community in that moment. So I'm curious to know how you handle that.
Yeah, it's so interesting because like I think even 2 months into posting was when I first hit this weird burnout phase where I was like, I am burnt out of talking about something that I live with. But it was weird because I'm also like, but I create like I have the choice to do this every day. I have the choice to show up and create content or not. So why am I making this bigger than it has to be? If I'm burnt out, I can take a step back. But it is really tough because there is a bit of a burnout sequence in terms of feeling overwhelmed by A, I have to be informed in the news. You want to stay on top. Basma mentioned this earlier, but staying on top of the trends is such a big part of what you do as a creator is like trying to always be a part of what's happening in news cycles and otherwise. And so I think for me, it's been this weird balance of like, the way I handle it is looking at it like I can't take a step back from diabetes, but I can take a step back from posting content. I can take a step back from engaging in the community. And that isn't a bad thing. Taking a step back, I don't know why. Maybe it's because we're all so over producers with diabetes. We're always on top. We're so vigilant. But for me, taking a step back almost felt like offensive. But I was like, it's not offensive because my best version of myself is the version that can be there, that can be part of my community, that can engage with the community. And I'm doing a disservice to my community when I show up when my tank is half empty. And so sometimes for me, it's just reminding myself that taking a step back is the best thing I can do in terms of content creation, in terms of the voice that I'm putting out there. And again, inherently taking a step back is not a negative thing. It is a part of life. We do it in all parts of our life. I mean, we all sleep for 8 hours a day. That's taking a step back. So why aren't we trying to think about that in terms of our content and the way we look at life? So for me, it's been a really weird balance. I've only been doing this for 6 months, which is a small in the grand scheme of content creation. But I try to remind myself burnout is normal. And I actually share about the burnout. I tell my audience when I'm feeling burnt out because they resonate with that. They understand that and they get that that is a part of posting and living with diabetes.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So I know we've just been talking about negative news so far, but there actually has been plenty of good news too. There are just a couple updates from the DPAC end. So recently, like CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, allowed the Medicare Diabetes Prevention Program, or MDPP, to be delivered to patients virtually through 2029. That's something that we've been advocating for through regulation and legislation. On the PBM reform front, which is pharmacy benefit managers, Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act 2026, which included a lot of PBM reforms that we've been advocating for years. So in certain states as well, Virginia, New York, bills have been passed. So a lot of these things have happened and we just don't hear about them. How do you think some of these messages can become more front and center to continue like motivating people to engage in advocacy or just to feel motivated about diabetes in general?
I think for me, one thing I've noticed, because like I said, I'm in the world of social services. My whole job from 9 till 5 is advocacy in a completely different form. And what I've noticed over the years is that fear is usually a bigger motivator than hope is for a lot of people. Because to Allison's point, our brains are just wired to see danger, and we let fear spread like wildfire if we allow it to. And so I think for me, it's really important, especially in an age of AI and the resurgence of fake articles and fake news and just all of these things that aren't actually human voices. It's really important that we incorporate storytelling into our advocacy because people need reminders that change is happening. Policies are changing, conversations are advancing thanks to the efforts of actual human beings on the ground. And so when we hear how policy changes in our communities, when we see how advocacy can directly impact our relationships with our diabetes, I think that is the most important form of advocacy. And we're losing a lot of that with the resurgence of AI, with quick stories for clickbait and sensationalism. And so I think we need more balance in how we we talk about it, diabetes, not the toxic positivity, not the pretending things are perfect, but not creating an environment where we only ever see bad things. Advocacy can exist without fear, exhaustion, and hopelessness. And I think so many of us are stuck in cynicism because that's what we've been living with for 20 plus years of diabetes, or at least in my experience. And so I try to focus on sharing information that educates people, that resonates with audiences, because that's how we move advocacy forward, is seeing yourself in advocacy.
Yeah, I think also, like I was saying before, a lot of the media is really, you know, uh, built to get clicks and likes and shares. And so I think those who are feeling overwhelmed by the media, people who are here watching and kind of trying to figure out how, how to navigate this, I think it is going to probably, take some real like curation of like your media sources and where you choose to get your content. Um, and who you choose to follow or what media sources you choose. There are I think it's called like the Good News Network or something like that, I believe is the name, which is like a media source that's all about good things that are happening, because it is really easy, I think, for the good news to be kind of drowned out. I know when I go to some media sources, like, yeah, they might post some like, success stories or breakthroughs or whatever, but it's like way down at the bottom of the page, and like the kind of the horror stories are like the headliners. And so if you go and that's all you're really having time to read, you'll miss out on some of the good work that people are able are doing. And then I think in terms of diabetes, I think there's some really good diabetes news sources. I really like to follow Diatribe, is probably one of my favorite places to go. They've got like a daily email, and then they also have like I don't know if it's monthly or weekly newsletter where they have even more stories that they're publishing, and a lot of that is like they're not clickbaity people. Like their stories are very much unbiased and kind of rooted in the science and rooted on being very realistic and practical and kind of what their analysis and assessment of things are. And so I think that can help at least me feel a little bit more grounded, that I'm not being set up. I think sometimes the media feels like a setup. And I think if you can find the right media sources that you're going to be consuming, that can really help you want to stay engaged. Can help decrease some of that stress and overwhelm and overload in an already stressful and overwhelming world.
Yeah, for sure. So in addition to that, this what I mentioned, the good news that does exist. So as you mentioned, it's a lot to keep track of, and that's without even bringing diabetes into the picture sometimes, just like in general good news. So as people, all of us who are like constantly exposed to information and data and faced with decisions as well, how do you decide what's actually worth paying attention to or sharing with all this influx of data? Like we are the first people in our bloodline to experience this much information on a daily basis.
I think for me, it's always checking the accuracy of information. Like we live in a day and age where people can just make up anything that they want. And then especially when you're on social media, it's so easy to fall into this trap of somebody said this, so therefore it must be the truth. And I think,
Mhm.
especially as a content creator, it's my responsibility to fact check, to double check sources, to ensure that what's being said and presented is actually accurate for the audiences that are going to consume it. Because we're living in a day and age where, again, AI, extremely fast moving cycles for the news, all contributes to this responsibility for all of us to stop, check, and make sure that we're doing our research before we speak on something, because not everything that's viral is accurate, nuanced, fact checked enough. All of our experiences with diabetes are so vastly different. So I always have to ask myself, would sharing this leave someone feeling more informed or empowered, or is it just going to leave someone feeling overwhelmed? Because those experiences are two very different experiences.
Yeah. I think knowing who you're, again, knowing who you're following is really, really important. Yeah, knowing the sources of the information. Um, I think understanding someone's background or someone's bias is really important in what kind of media you're going to be consuming, whether that's on social media or whether that's print, television, other news sources, newspapers. A lot of these people, especially I think because traditional media is, I don't want to say going the way of the dinosaurs, but certainly is not like the primary news source for a lot of people anymore. It is a lot of these content creators, and not all content creators are created equal. Like we've got, some good ones here, but a lot of these, wellness influencers that people follow, are podcasts. I'm not even including I completely forgot about podcasts. Podcasters have followings in like the millions, right? Millions and millions of people who are listening and perpetuating some of this content, and it can be just completely inaccurate. So making sure that you're following people who have either some kind of like ethical standard that they're following. So a lot of news, organizations do follow, are supposed to follow like some ethical guidelines. And then also there are some influencers, who are also doctors or they're registered nurses or they're registered dietitians. And they also have licensed therapists, have an ethics board that they are accountable to. And so if you're following people who actually have some kind of accountability, I think that's a really important thing. And, even if they're going to be, potentially sharing, negative or dismaying news, not necessarily everything's going to be super positive, at least knowing that that content's truthful, I think is important.
Yeah, for sure. Welcome back, Basaman. We were
All right,
struggling to
guys.
get
That
there.
was rough.
No, it's fine. The question, just so for background, if you want to chime in a little bit, was,
Yeah.
so we are being exposed to like more information than ever before in human
Mhm.
history. And how do you decide what's actually worth paying attention to or sharing, especially in the context of, we also were just talking about spotlighting good news and trying to make sure that good news is even represented.
Yeah. Well, as Allison said, the bias that we have towards danger is very real. So if anything, I always try to remind myself, like, always look at the good news. And I've made it a point to like follow. There's some like local social media accounts like in California that it's like Good News California, Good News San Diego, and it's like they're basically accounts that like only highlight really good news, and it can be as funny as like you know or as sweet as like being reunified with like their family or whatever. It's just like good news only. So I try to always like follow accounts that I know actually bring me joy, even if it's nothing related to diabetes, nothing related to like the worldly events. It's just joyful to me because I think it's important that you break up your feed with seeing things that like actually make you happy. I think the second thing is just understanding that, unfortunately, as you all said, like in the time that we live in, we are going to be seeing more news than I think we ever have, but more news than maybe we ever realized we needed at the same time. We're also seeing news around the entire world, and it's kind of our own personal responsibilities to know what's serving us and what's not serving us. And I think that goes both for the news and the media that we're consuming, but the media that we're also producing and putting out. And as I shared with you guys a little while ago, was I stopped producing diabetes content because I was getting so burnt out that I realized it wasn't serving me any purpose. And so I had to take a step back. I think now more than ever, I'm more cognizant of what those signs are when I am getting burnt out from content, when I'm getting burnt out from diabetes content, when it's just getting to be a point where, okay, this isn't doing me any good. And I owe it to myself to always make sure that I feel good in what I create and what I actually consume. So I like to. I like to describe it as like a two-way street, not just what you're seeing, but what you're creating, and making sure that you always put what's serving you first, because then you can actually be of service to other people.
Yeah, well put. So on that note, actually, more on the how to not lose your mind aspect of things. So how do you balance being informed with not letting the news dictate your mood or your day, do you have any practical tools or habits that you've developed to consume news or break your own cycles?
I actually recently saw something online that completely changed even my perspective about diabetes, but the news in general, which is this thing called the glass versus rubber principle. And I've shared it before, but I don't know if everybody knows it. Essentially, what it is in life, we have to distinguish the difference between things that are glass to us, things that when they break, that you can't put it back together very easily, and the things that are rubber, which is basically rubber bounces, right? When something happens and it drops, it hits the floor, it bounces, and life keeps moving. And I think a lot of the time you have to think about that in the context of the news. Not every headline, social media argument, fight that you see, post that happens online has to require your attention immediately. There are certain things in the news that are definitely glass that we should pay attention to: our insurance, our health, access to insulin, affordability. But there are so many parts of diabetes and in the news that it should just be rubber. You should let it go because it doesn't matter long term. And I think we're conditioned with diabetes to treat so much of our life with constant vigilance and hypervigilance, but that isn't emotionally sustainable in the long term. So I look at that in how I choose to perceive the news, because sometimes you have to step away, like Basma was mentioning, in order to feel more comfortable coming back later and feeling stronger and more confident when you do come back later. So I think sometimes it's not a bad thing to step away from the news, to give yourself that hour or days, because being uninformed doesn't mean that you care. It just means that sometimes you're protecting and putting yourself first in those moments. And so for me, again, that glass versus rubber principle, I try to bring it to all parts of my life because not everything deserves my time and attention, and not everything should get my time and attention.
Yeah, that's really helpful for diabetes management too, I think.
Oh, I talk
Because
about it in diabetes management a lot. Like, for example, the rubber parts of diabetes, a bad day, a bad high,
yeah.
a bolus that you regret later. Those are all things that in the moment were like, that was the worst thing I could have ever done. But 2 or 3 days later, you forget that that even happened. You've conditioned yourself to just move on. But then there's things
Mhm.
that are like glass, like our relation.
Right. Did Austin bug?
Uh-oh.
Oh no. Well, all right. Well, does anyone want to jump in while we wait for him to come back?
I was just gonna say, kind of on my last point, I think you have to be really honest with yourself. We're kind of navigating social media still as a baby. Like social media is still a new thing. I think social media to this extent is a new thing. TikTok, Instagram, Reels, posts, carousels, like all of these are new features that we're kind of learning about and actually going through the motions for the first time at this large of a platform and how many people are on social media. So I think it's important that you're actually honest with yourself of like, sit down and create a list. What kind of content is important for you, and kind of how Austin related it. What's rubber versus what's glass? And then that way you can decide when you are under stress and when you are under those moments where you're seeing something and it feels kind of like flight or fight. Okay, is this important to me, or can I just scroll past this? And I think the biggest thing that I've learned over the last couple of years is that that's going to be different for everybody, and that's okay. What matters most to you may not matter most to somebody else, and you're just going to have to navigate that in real time. It could be a best friend, it could be a family member, it could be whatever, right? Or family members may send you links and be like, "Did you see this? The latest thing about diabetes cure? Can you sign up for it? Can you tell your doctor about it?" And you have to be able and comfortable to kind of put boundaries in place and be like, "Hey, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. However, XYZ," or whatever it is that your spiel is going to be, kind of like an elevator pitch. And I realized like having those boundaries set and communicated with yourself first is the most seamless way of being able to actually use them in times of stress, which I call them. So, like when you're actually seeing some bad news on social media, or when a family member reaches out or a friend reaches out, that's when you can actually utilize those skills because you've practiced them with yourself first. I would say that's probably the biggest thing that I've learned.
Thank you. Sorry, Austin, you bugged a little bit. You want to finish what you were saying earlier?
Yeah, sorry, I have no idea where I ended up bugging out, but I was just
I think
saying in the
you were
glass.
saying the things that were glass were like we were giving examples of things within diabetes
Yeah, like
management.
your mental health, for example, like that's such an important part of management. The burnout that you experience, the depression, the anxiety, like all of that stuff, when they break, it is so much harder. Like, again, I experienced burnout for 10 years. It took me 10 years to pull myself out of that. That is not something that is like a band-aid effect versus the rubber things, which is, again, I've had a bad day. You keep moving on. You move past that. I try not to, when I have a bad diabetes day, I just try to remind myself myself like it's par for the course with this condition. I can't be perfect 24/7. And so I just try to remind myself like it is okay to let go of things sometimes to protect your mental health.
Yeah, thank you. And Allison, in your experience with your clients, are there any like tactics that your go-to tactics?
I mean, I think with anything, what everyone's been saying about, boundaries is really important. I mean, I think one thing that has come up is, and especially I think it came up a lot during the COVID years, was just my clients feeling the need that they owed themselves or somebody else like to consume a lot of media, like they had to stay informed, they needed to stay informed, I know they owed the world or society or something their time, and they're like, I need to stay informed, I don't want to miss something. I and I think that there are like I understand where that comes from. That's a very values driven behavior, but I think there are some consequences to that behavior that I think are also unintended. When you're consuming so much news, especially the way that the news is presented, if you're not setting limits, it can start to warp your reality, kind of your sense of reality, because the not that there aren't negative things happening in the world, but it can kind of skew our sense of the world, which can lead to a lot of anxiety and depression and kind of hopelessness. And so I love, and I think this was an earlier question, but what Bosma was saying about like having some specific good news resources or news sources to follow to help kind of balance things out, so that you're not just consuming one thing, kind of one type of news, is something that I've seen help my clients a lot, as well as setting limits. I think time limits or limits on the news source itself. Um, when they consume media is also important. I may be jumping ahead a couple of questions, but while I'm thinking about it, not consuming content that you might find distressing before bed. That's when people's anxiety that's just natural because there's less external stimulus happening when you're going to bed. And so you're laying in bed and you're scrolling, and I don't want to judge anyone. I do it too. But like you're laying in bed and you're scrolling because that's what you're doing as you're trying to fall asleep. But what it ends up doing, I mean, blue light, not not notwithstanding like that technology wise, it's not great to be on devices that late, but also from like a psychological standpoint, like getting our minds to be thinking more, that's like not the time to do it. We don't want to be trying to problem solve or plan or be exposed to like new ideas right before we are trying to like relax and actually kind of quiet the mind. And so all of these are strategies that I have talked about with my clients who feel an immense amount of anxiety about the world. There's some real existential issues that people come to counseling with, and these don't necessarily solve them, but they can make them a little bit more manageable until you can kind of get to the point where you can, like in therapy, where you can actually sit down with somebody and actually hash out your feelings and your concerns.
Yeah, I really like the part where you were mentioning how people feel like a moral obligation to be constantly updated. It's really interesting because I feel like I've heard that kind of rhetoric a lot too. And I think what people sometimes don't think about in that context is like we're not all built the same. Like some people can like consume so much content and like just be like, okay, like moving on, or like, and some people are really deeply affected. And like that is no value judgment whatsoever. Like just real people are built differently. And I think it's just not like realistic for some people to be doing that all the time. So it's totally separate from morality. Um, my
Yeah,
next
that's a good
question.
term for it. Kind of a moral obligation. That's a good way to use it.
So my last question actually is, why is it important for the diabetes community to support and stay engaged with each other? And why might advocacy play a role in actually countering or fighting this burnout in the context of news?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Go ahead, Matt. Basma.
I was gonna say one other thing that I think, and I think it especially relates to this question, is um dividing up your time when it comes to media and what you're spending it on into buckets. And I think for anybody watching who is a person living with diabetes, and maybe does something else in the diabetes space, but on top of that is, someone that is on social media, whether you create social media, whether you just consume it, I think that still is a very valid use of your time doing social media, but it being diabetes related. It's important that you connect more personably, so actually creating those relationships, sliding into your favorite creators DMs, as we like to say, and just like saying hi, just introducing yourself, more than just like someone that maybe you comment on their post, but like actually getting to know one another and creating those friendships is really important, because it's in times where you might be feeling burnout, or you might be feeling some distress, or you might be feeling some anxiety, or you don't know who else to really ask. You can reach out to those relationships. I've created some of the most special friendships in the diabetes space through just social media, through Instagram years ago, by like, sliding into the DMs, introducing myself, saying hi, like getting to know these people that you, I feel weird saying like look up to, but getting to know these people on an actual real basis. Because at the end of the day, we're all just human beings, and we all crave emotional connectivity. And so connecting with one another, I think, is an amazing way to make sure that you're staying above all of this doom and gloom of the news. And then relating it to kind of what I wanted to piggyback off of our last question, dividing your time into buckets. So I'll use myself for example, but I do a lot of diabetes research as well, and so that's a lot that's kind of tied into the news of seeing what's out there, what's been done, what hasn't been done, actually doing my research myself. So I like to divide my time into like, here's how much time I'm going to spend today, and every day looks different, obviously, because I have different obligations that I need to do. Work days look different because I work in the diabetes space as well, so there's a lot of diabetes focus on those days. But I'll divide them into buckets and say, here's how much time I'm going to spend on actual work that's related to diabetes, on research that's related to diabetes, on just scrolling news related diabetes stuff that I have to maybe do for a paper that's coming up, and then actual social media. And the social media for me isn't always diabetes, because I have a lot of creators that I follow and friends that aren't in the diabetes space, but I still divvy that up into its own bucket, because it's still media that I'm consuming, and it's still a lot of alertness that my mind has to be on, because at the same time, as Allison said so perfectly, like your brain is filtering, like, do I need to pay attention to this? Do I not? Is this high risk? Is this low risk? Like your brain is still filtering all of that. I think the dividing buckets has been really helpful for me, because once I kind of reach that time limit, I'm like, all right, I gotta stick to my word, and I gotta log off for work, log off for social media, log off for this. And it allows me to kind of differentiate everything, and then be able to kind of retreat back into like who I am at the end of the day without all of this. So I would say it's really important to actually create relationships that go beyond just liking someone's post on social media and getting to know your creators that can actually become good friends and support system, but also being honest with yourself and knowing when enough social media is enough.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Basil, you said it so perfectly. Like, there's so much I just resonated with what you said. But I think, too, you said something very earlier, which is like we're all reminded of the physical parts of diabetes because we carry the pumps, we have the scars, the infusion sets. And I think a lot of us forget sometimes just how mental diabetes is. Like, it's
Yeah.
not talked enough about at endocrinology appointments. You go there and they're assessing numbers and charts and data, but we don't spend enough time actually focusing on the mental health aspect of diabetes. And we all know this. The best thing you can do for your mental health is find other people who understand, who get it. And one of my favorite parts of content creation is on the other side of this, getting those DMs from people telling me
Yeah.
their story and how my content relates, because it's a two-way street. You are healing parts of my mental health when I hear about how
Mhm.
my stories are creating positive impact. And in that same lens, we're creating a relationship that isn't just you liked a post and we've moved on. It doesn't just become this transactional thing like money passing between hands. We've created a relationship where we can come back to each other. And I was saying this before we started the webinar, but I recently went through food poisoning. And I was able to share with my audience that I went through food poisoning, had no idea how to manage it. And I got so many wonderful experiences, stories. And it just, to your point about advocacy and burnout, when we talk about the things that matter to us, it becomes a part of who we are. And yes, people say, I don't want diabetes to be my identity because there is danger in that as well. But we do live with diabetes. It is part of our story. And it's important that we find people who also share that love for diabetes and that story because it is part of their lives. And the
Yeah.
number one thing I have done for my mental health in diabetes is finding community, going out and meeting people who live in Toronto, going for a lunch with somebody. And every time I make those lunch dates, I'm like, oh my God, Austin, I'm so nervous. Why did I do this? And I leave that conversation or that lunch date going, that was the best thing I ever did for myself. That was an hour of my own mental health and peace. That was free therapy that I just got for an hour. So if I can make any one recommendation to anybody out there that's watching this, advocacy doesn't have to be calling a congresswoman or a congressman. It can just be teaching the people around you what it means to live life with diabetes. Because the more the regular, average, everyday person understands what this is like, the more our voices get carried to everybody.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I also wanted to mention that the aspect of, I think I didn't know this before I started like working in advocacy, but like the what we talked about earlier in this call about control, like feeling the lack of control and like certain aspects of your life because of so many parts about diabetes that seem like they're under your control, but they're not. I feel like that is also a way for a lot of advocates, like advocacy is a way for a lot of advocates to feel that sense of control because like I feel like you're seeing concrete ways that you can affect diabetes, whether it's for yourself or for others, or help other people essentially manage their diabetes by, expanding access. And like that's the way that you're maybe you're having a bad day with diabetes and you're like, well, let me do something good for the greater good for the diabetes community. I feel like that's a very like healthy coping mechanism that I think a lot of us have developed in advocacy. And that's something that kind of like inspires me watching our community.
Just to piggyback on that, Amanda, I mean, I think to go along with that, like control, but also like powerlessness, like would be the opposite, the opposite. Like we want control, but we also like because we feel powerless. And I think one of the things that the media, whether it's diabetes media or any other kind of media, often like it can unintentionally evoke is just like, I am powerless. Like there is so much going on in the world, and I have very little influence over a lot of it. And getting that message again and again and again really starts to amplify like our sense of powerlessness, our sense of hopelessness. And so advocacy can be kind of an antidote to that. When you get engaged in anything, whether that's on like a big international scale, a national scale, a city scale, whatever it is, your own clinic, your town that you live in, trying to get together with people, to teach, raise awareness, fundraise, whatever it is. I mean, advocacy can look like a lot of things. It starts to build this sense in people that I am doing something, I am contributing, I have some control, I have some influence in this big, scary, overwhelming thing called diabetes. I mean, right after this, I'm going to be heading down to a board meeting for Breakthrough T1D for our local chapter. That's the next, so that's my advocacy. Well, in addition to this, and so participating in things both like I'm online, talking about things. People around the country, around the world are watching this, but I'm also, also doing things like in your hometown. Like it doesn't necessarily need to be a big splashy like get a million followers, people don't have to be a content creator to be an advocate. You don't have to be on panels to be an advocate. I think sometimes we can kind of go like we can discount a lot of things, but the relationships, like Basma and Austin have been saying, like the relationships are really important. No matter where those are being built.
Yeah, I feel like people forget that social media is like the ultimate way to connect with other people. I feel like these days it's being seen as like, your content creator or your friend is like on a platform and they're on a stage and they're performing for you. They're like court gesturing. And I'm like, no, it's actually like they should be intertwined with everyone and you should not be afraid to respond to their story or to like it or to message them. Like we
And
forget it's a network.
And you also don't have to do social media. If there are people watching
Yeah.
this who
Yeah.
don't want to do social media, if you're like on Facebook just to watch this, but you're like, I don't really want to put my life out there. you don't have to in order to still make a difference, a meaningful difference in the causes that you care about.
And
Allison,
it's
I think you're
completely
a great
normal to
example.
like go back and forth. Like that whole, oh, I want to create content. Oh, maybe now I don't. Like maybe now I want to take a step back. Like it's totally normal to have this relationship with it. I think the most important thing is if you have social media and that doesn't mean like if you just have social media, it's your digital diary. That's the way I like to think about it. Like you get to decide what you put on it. You get to decide what you engage with, you get to decide what you like. And this is really just a way for you to look back at the beautiful memories and life that you've lived. If you decide that you want to create content towards a specific topic or diabetes for example, then that's something that you get to control and decide too, and nobody can take that away from you. You can decide when you want to step back from that, and I think that's a very important aspect that a lot of people tend to forget because you get wrapped up in this whole I'm on a platform and I need to perform. Just be yourself. I would say number one thing is just be yourself.
And I was just going to say to Allison's point, advocacy can be as tiny as just wearing your CGM in public, like freely and openly, because someone comes up to you and says, "What is that? I don't know what that is." And that has, you've just created advocacy right then and there because you've educated someone on something that you live with. I think everybody always assumes like advocacy has to be big and flashy, but if being in social services and in this as a profession has taught me anything, just being in a room is advocacy enough sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, really well said. Thank you guys so much. I know we had like so many technical issues throughout this call, but I'm gonna clip this and we're gonna put the best bites on social media after this whole conversation so that people can have good
How
news on.
appropriate though, a topic about social media and we have so many issues with our phones. Very on
I
brand.
know. I know. Yeah. Well, it doesn't always go according to plan. That's part of the
Technology, can't live with it, can't live without it.
Do it. No.
yeah. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much to our lovely panelists for being here. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Amanda. Bye, everyone.